Welcome to our fourth and final AP Psychology Cramathon. We're going to call this Revolutions. So this is going to be units 12 through 14, so the most recent stuff that you've covered in class. So hopefully you should remember a lot of this anyway. Um, and then what we'll do after this is we'll take a practice test, multiple choice, and then some FRQs. All right, so let's get started. All right, so question number 1 says, what is the claim of the labeling theory? The labeling theory is basically if you've been labeled as either deviant or having a mental disorder, just that once you've been labeled that it's kind of hard to shake that. Uh, the labels, it explains why people's behavior clashes with social norms. So that's good, but again, it could be a bad thing where once you're labeled, it's kind of hard to shake. What is the psychodynamic / psychoanalytic take on psychological disorders? Well, just like anything else, it's that it's stemming from your unconscious, or like something happened in your past that's still unconsciously there, and what's making this, whatever this disorder is, happen. Um, it assists, and when you use these types of therapies for psychological disorder, it can assist with helping you come to terms and identify like the origin of where this all started. And usually you see this perspective used a lot to treat anxiety disorders. What is the cognitive behavior approach to psychology? Or sorry, psychopathology, so that's your abnormal psych. It focuses on the situation at hand rather than the origin. So that's how it's different than psychoanalytic. So cognitive behavioral is instead of focusing on what happened in my past that's looming in my unconscious that is making this happen, it's focusing on, all right, so this is what's happening now. Let's fix the here and now. Let's change your current thoughts. Let's change your current behavior. 4, what is the biological approach to psychopathology, abnormal psychology? Well, that's the medical model. All right, treating abnormal psychology and mental disorders as if it were an illness like the flu or like cancer, something that could be medically treated. All right, so to treat it like that it has to find a cure and it's a sickness. The systems approach, and how does it attempt to address problems of psychopathology? The systems approach, that's your biopsychosocial approach. So where you combine biological, psychological, and social, all those approaches we talked about up to this point, into one thing. That it's not any one thing that causes or produces psychological disorders, but it's a combination of like mind, body, and spirit type stuff all rolled into one. The 6, the evolutionary explanation for psychopathology, it's genetic. All right, so it's evolved. It's in your gene pool. Like schizophrenia is genetic. Um, then you've got autism also has its basis in genetics. Uh, Anorexia, obesity, so some eating disorders as well. So that's the evolutionary school of thought. What is the DSM-4? It should say 5 now because we have DSM-5. And how is it used and what are the axes? Well, it's diagnostic criteria. It's how you diagnose the different disorders, right? So it's all the criteria that psychologists have to use to be able to diagnose you with a certain disorder. So that way so that way one psychologist isn't going to say, oh, you're suffering from bipolar, and another one's going to say schizophrenia. No, it's very clear, concise criteria that they all have to go by, so hopefully they all come up with the same diagnosis. Um, and it has very specific axes. If you remember in class, we talked about there's 5 of them. Right, the first one is a list of like 16, I think it is, principal disorders. So 16 principal disorders that you could possibly have. Whether you have something or not in that category, they're still going to check axis 2, which is your like personality disorders. Then they're going to check axis 3. What is your medical history? Do you have any like other medical condition that could be a contributor to the psychological or personality disorders in axis 1 and 2. Axis 4 is psychological stressors. Is there anything that could be causing stress to cause this? Like anything that could explain these a little better? And that'll help us to narrow down what exactly you have or what type or subsection of it is. And finally, axis 5 is your levels of functioning, like on a scale of 1 to 100. 100 being you're highly functional, you're able to really function out in society with this mental disorder. At 0, you need to be hospitalized immediately. You're a danger to yourself and others. Um, what are the major infancy, childhood, and adolescent disorders? Well, you've got, let's see, well, there's mental retardation, learning disorders, motor skills disorders, communication disorders, developmental disorders, ADD and ADHD, eating disorders, separation anxiety as well, and then you could develop like tics. Um, Not like the bug, but like tics that sometimes people with Tourette's get, but maybe not as extreme. You just develop like my husband does this thing where he just constantly will breathe out through his nose, and I know when he's stressed because it's a tic that he's developed. He can't help it. It's kind of it's there. It's unconscious, but it's something abnormal, a little twitch that kind of like it tells that you're stressed. Um, what's the main psychotic disorder? And what are the signs and symptoms? Well, a psychotic disorder, right, the main psychotic disorder is schizophrenia, right? And if it's a psychotic disorder, that means that your perception of reality is altered. And we see that a lot in schizophrenia. The symptoms of that being just the broad schizophrenia symptoms, um, delusions, right? You have delusions of grandeur or delusions of persecution, or both. Hallucinations, mostly auditory. Keep that in mind for schizophrenics. It's not that they see hallucinations, but they hear them. So that's the voices. Um, as well as disorganized speech and thoughts, possible being like catatonic, so things like that. And schizophrenia is considered a psychotic disorder, again, because if you think about the criteria, it has altered their perception of reality. 10, what are major mood disorders? That's where you have your bipolar and depression. Depression is like the common cold of the psychological disorders. Everybody gets it at one point or another. However, if it lasts for like a prolonged period of time and sticks around, then it's not just you're having a depressive episode, it's you have major depressive disorder and probably need a mood stabilizer. And then bipolar disorder is you have depression, but you also have instances of mania. So you go from really low to really high, really high to really low. So there you go. 11. What is a somatoform disorder? Somatoform disorders are things like hypochondria. It's where you have symptoms and of something like you look ill, you feel ill, but there's nothing actually physically wrong with you. It's all in your head. 12, what's a dissociative disorder and how does DID differ from schizophrenia? DID is multiple personality disorders. All right, it differs from schizophrenia because schizophrenia, if you do have those delusions of grandeur where you think you're Superman or you think you're someone else or you hear voices, that doesn't mean you are another person. Right? DID, you split. Something traumatic happened that you could not deal with, and you blacked out, and a whole nother personality emerged. All right, so make sure you know that. 13, what are some of the major types of personality disorders? We've got a lot, all right? I'm going to list them. I think I have them alphabetically. Antisocial, which again, it doesn't mean like you keep to yourself. It means your behaviors are against society. So this is linked to criminal behavior. Avoidant, which is exactly what it sounds like. You avoid people. Borderline. People with borderline personality disorder tend to be very unsure of their identity. They have some like role confusion going on there. They also tend to engage in acts of self-harm. Dependent personality disorder is they're clingy. Histrionic is they have to be the center of attention. And their emotions may be a little, like they may seem a little irrational at times and erratic because they're trying to maintain your attention. Narcissistic, don't confuse that with histrionic. Right? Narcissistic isn't they have to be the center of attention. In their own mind, they are the only one that matters. Right? A narcissist doesn't care about someone else's feelings. It is all about them. You have your paranoid personality disorder, which is they're paranoid. Then you have schizoid and schizoid typal. Right? Don't mix those up. They're they both have like the delusions, different forms of the delusions of schizophrenia, but it's not full on schizophrenia because there's no hallucinations present. So schizoid, that's where they tend to um, detach from relationships, have difficult like displaying emotions, very restricted range of emotions that they can display. They're the loners, right? They're what we tend to think of as antisocial, but they're not. They're loners. They're schizoid. All right, schizoid typal. They're the ones that they have extreme discomfort in relationships, and usually it's because they're very, we'll use the term eccentric, and tend to have very odd beliefs. Right, and then there's also not obsessive compulsive disorder, right? That's different. Obsessive compulsive personality disorder is like a more mild version of that. It's where you have the obsessions and not so much the compulsions, or the compulsions you have are more minor and not quite as disturbing to your day to day. Where am 14. What is the difference between negative and positive symptoms? Negative symptoms is when you are removing normal behaviors, right? And positive symptoms is where you are adding abnormal behaviors. 15, the neurotransmitter connected with schizophrenia is dopamine. The neurotransmitter connected with depression is serotonin. And the one that you can't see because it's blocked off by the recorder, the one that is involved in Alzheimer's is, I think it's pronounced acetylcholine. I'm never sure on the pronunciation of it. It's that ACH one that's linked with Alzheimer's. And 16, what's the difference between an obsession and compulsion? Remember, obsession is the thought that keeps going over and over and over in your mind. You are obsessed with it. And then your compulsion is your action, right, a behavior. Now, you have these compulsions because what it does is it decreases the anxiety that's caused by the obsession. So you have a compulsion to try and get rid of that. Right? And it's only a temporary relief because eventually it'll come back. All right, 17. Define the following terms. Free association. So all three of these terms that are listed here are all psychoanalytic terms. Free association is the first thing that comes to mind. All right, so when you're taking the Rorschach ink blot test, or when you're taking the, or just talking to Freud, and he says, when I say iPhone, what's the first thing that comes to your mind? You know, and you'd say that. Transference is where if you're the client, right, and you're talking about how angry you are at your mother, and that's why you're in therapy in the first place, and you're transferring that feeling, that anger that you have, to your psychologist, and you're taking it out on them. You're displacing, all right? You're transferring that emotion to someone else. Now, generally, you'll have your psychologist will be very calm about this whole thing and try to like keep that from happening, and get you back on track because they don't want you to feel super either like really really lovey-dovey with them, you become obsessed with them, or they don't want you to dislike them and hate them or fear them. If you've seen the movie Step Brothers, right, when Will Ferrell's character goes to his therapist and he like is in love with her, that's an example of transference. Countertransference is the opposite. It's where the analyst, so the psychologist, kind of displaces their feelings onto their subject, the patient. 18, what is the difference between psychoanalytic and psychodynamic approach to psychotherapy? Up to this point, we've been talking about how those two terms are interchangeable for the same thing, and to an extent they are, but when we talk about the the therapy that's behind that approach, that's where it does become different. Uh, they're slightly different based on frequency of the sessions that last. So your psychoanalytic um, is basically your free association. It's not as frequent, not as many sessions that you go to. It's not as in depth. Whereas psychodynamic is you do the same stuff, but they really delve in a lot deeper. So psychodynamic is a more in-depth psychoanalysis. All right, 19, what is the cognitive behavioral approach to psychotherapy? I actually believe I asked you this back in question number 3. So just refer to question number 3 for the first part of question number 19. But for the second part, what is the difference between cognitive and behavioral on their own terms? So when they're together, like we talked about in number 3, it's like, okay, you have to change your cognitive thought, like your thoughts and your behaviors, all right, in order to overcome um, this disorder. So when you use those two things separately, right, you're just cognitively just changing your thoughts, or just behavioral, you just change your actions. 20, what are the differences between systematic desensitization, exposure techniques, and flooding? All right, the systematic desensitization is, that's like um, you're, it's using classical conditioning. You use that to remove fear, and you use a hierarchy of fear. Like you don't just jump in and say, okay, we're removing this. Right? No, you want to gradually build up to removing what is that big fear. So if you are afraid of tarantulas, all right, and it's a bad example, but go with me. Tarantulas, all right. I'm going to start off by conditioning you to not be afraid of, let's say, like a picture of a spider or a small house spider. Like I'm going to gradually build up to it and condition you to no longer be afraid of those things. So that way when we do get to the real fear, it's easier to overcome it. Exposure technique is similar, right? A little different. It's where you're exposed to exactly what your fear is, but in a non-dangerous way, in a safe environment. Um, and flooding is basically exposure, the exposure technique, but it's prolonged. So it's like you're doing that for a long period of time. You are flooding them with that, and they're gonna have to get over it. Uh, 21. What is a token economy? What does a token economy function? How does it function? Remember when we did in class, I think we did something with Cougar Cash, all right? And that was a reinforcement, all right, for good behavior. That's how a token economy works. It's almost like whatever that reinforcement is, you assign it some type of value and you could trade it in for something else. So that's token economy. And the reason we're bringing it back up in Unit 12 is because you'll notice that sometimes in psych wards and hospitals and things like that, they'll come up with stuff like that for patients, if for good behavior, or they're taking steps to overcome their disorder and they're doing a great job. You want to reward them, and sometimes you do it on a token economy system. It's like, okay, now you could trade this in for something else. Like now you get like a free day, like so things like that. 22, what is the basis for Ellis's rational emotive therapy? Well, he bases this on irrational assumptions. So it's like it causes anxiety. And the reason is because it's like you're worrying about stuff that it's completely irrational. That is not going to happen. So there's an event coming up, and your thoughts about it are so negative that then a consequence happens. All right. And this brings me to talk about number 23 with Beck. Beck kind of builds off of Ellis's irrational assumptions, and says that, well, you got to change those, and you're going to change them using cognitive therapy. You have to change those negative thoughts. All right, so remember, we're on 23 now. So changing negative thoughts, and you do this by, it's a cognitive triad that he created, so it's like a triangle. So if you have negative thoughts about yourself, all right, go to the next point. You're going to have negative views about the world. And then if you go to the next point, you're going to have negative views about the future world. which is going to make you like feel negative about yourself again. So it's like there's 3 points to it, and we got to change that. Change one of those things, and you could break up the whole triangle. Um, 24, who came up with the idea of client-centered therapy? Also, it's called patient-centered therapy. You may see it referred to either way. That was Carl Rogers. All right, he's a humanist. So how did he use unconditional positive regard? It's like, well, you have to unconditional positive regard is you have to love yourself unconditionally no matter what. And when you're sitting there, and remember, the client-centered therapy is you're sitting there and you're talking about your problems, and the therapist is basically uh, restating your problem back to you, and you're coming up with your own solution. And in a way, it's helping you to create an unconditioned positive uh, regard for yourself, and then you're like, you realize that you're fine, and it's like the power was with you all along, like Dorothy and the Wizard of Oz. You had the shoes and the power all along. Again, really lame example, but go with me on this. 25, how does group therapy session function? That's basically where you'll have a psychologist and a group of, let's say, 15 people all together. There's a reason that they're all together. Let's say it's a group and they all are going to be talking about depression. So they're all there for a common theme. And the reason some people want to do it in groups is because that way they don't feel alone. All right, they don't feel alone in their disorder. They know that other people are going through the same thing. Maybe they can help each other. Um, Family therapy, similar, but instead of just a group of random people, it's a group with your family. Now, the reason they do family therapy is actually, let's say, a couple reasons. One, there's a member of the family who suffers from depression. Right? You bring the rest of the family in, one, because so they know how to all cope together as a unit, because they're family. Or two, you try to look at, okay, so one person's having a problem. Are other people in the family also having a problem? Are people in the family the cause of the problem? Right, so you all get to work that out together. And how is that related to marital therapy? That's couples therapy. It's like family therapy, but just with your significant other. All right, so same thing, but instead of the whole family, just your significant other. 26, how do antipsychotic medications work in relation to the neurotransmitter receptor relationship. Well, an antipsychotic, since if you have a psychotic disorder, your perception of reality is altered, so we need to like alter that back by altering certain chemicals in the brain. Um, Generally, you'll have antipsychotic meds that deal with dopamine, serotonin, um, ACH neurotransmitter, and they all work to change your behavior, mood, emotion, whatever it is that you need, that change in perception. The main one you're going to see is dopamine, used to treat schizophrenia, and what it does is it actually blocks the reuptake of it, so it doesn't like keep occurring. 27, it should say MAOIs. It should say MAOIs. The I is missing, right? MAOIs are used to treat. Oh, I lost myself. Oh, MAOIs are used to treat depression. It's an antidepressant, and what it does is it increases the levels of norepinephrine, serotonin, and dopamine in your system by inhibiting this certain type of enzyme. I forget the name of the enzyme, but it's an antidepressant, and it's like a very strong one. SSRIs have fewer side effects, but it is also an antidepressant. Lithium is used to treat bipolar disorder because it helps to you know, keep the mania down. And actually, lithium doesn't do anything to a neurotransmitter. It actually affects the flow of sodium through your nerves and muscle cells. All right, so the sodium, so too much like salt basically in your system excites your nerves and your muscles, and it sends you into this state of mania. Okay? And lithium helps to lower that down and balance that back out. Electroconvulsive therapy that's your electroshock therapy. So that's where you're sending electric currents passing through your brain. They do trigger a seizure, But what this does is it changes your brain chemistry and reverses the symptoms of your mental illness. Right? So, well, yes, dangerous and unpleasant, um, works. The benzodiazepines are medications that are anti-anxiety, and that deals with the neurotransmitter GABA. So it's like a sedative. It's an anticonvulsant, muscle relaxer. It's for anti-anxiety. Right, so that's what all of those do. All right, so pause the video here, go over your notes, make sure you've got everything, go back if you need to, let everything sink in, maybe go get yourself a snack, all right, some brain fuel, and then come on back and join us for the second half of the video. All right, welcome back. I'm assuming that you are ready to move on to the next bit, so here we go. All right, 28. What are implicit attitudes and how do they differ from explicit attitudes? Well, implicit attitudes are your like personal attitudes that come from within, and explicit ones come from outside. Um, 29. What is cognitive dissonance and how is it lessened? Think of dissonance as distance or behavior. I mean, not distance or difference. It's where your attitude and your behavior are different from one another. I use this example in class, like, you know smoking's bad for you, but you do it anyway. Right? That you have cognitive dissonance because the attitude of smoking being unhealthy and your behavior, you're doing it anyway, don't match up. All right, so this lessens by you need to find like a compromise. You need to find cognitive consistency. All right, we like things to be consistent. So that's what you're going to do. So one of those two things has to change so that they're on the same playing field. More like 9 times out of 10, it's going to be your attitude that changes because that's easier to change because your behavior becomes habit. And habits are hard to break. So your attitude is what's easier to change. So you're always going to start coming up with exceptions for the rules. Like, oh, I know it's unhealthy for me, but I've had a really bad day and I need it to calm my nerves. You still know it's bad for you, but you've started to rationalize it. You didn't change the behavior at all, but you are slightly changing your attitude. 30. What are some types of schemas? What types of schemas exist and how do they impact cognition? Well, remember what schemas are. It's your perception of like a prototype. Um, so you have schemas about certain roles people have, like jobs, and where they are, like what's the social context of what people are doing. You have person schemas, so like traits. So in your head, when you think of a lazy person, there's an image that comes to mind, right? You have schemas about yourself and about events, and both of those are based on expectations. Okay, so what you expect yourself to be, what you expect this birthday party that you're going to be like that image that you have in your head. Let's see, where are we? Okay, defines the following: stereotypes, discrimination, and prejudice. Stereotypes is where you have this widely held, fixed, oversimplified image of somebody or a group of people or something. Discrimination is where you have unjust treatment of somebody. And prejudice is where you have this preconceived opinion about somebody based on their race, religion, or whatever, and usually it's based on no reason at all. 32. What is the difference between external or situational and internal dispositional attribution, and how does it relate to fundamental attribution error? External, situational attribution. Remember, attribution is what causes it. Right? It's the cause. Well, what causes something to happen? It's like you're blaming something external. You're blaming a situation for why something happened. Internal or disposition attribution is it's like you're taking it on yourself. Like, oh, my bad. It's my fault that this happened. You're taking it onto yourself. So like personal attribution. How does this relate to fundamental attribution error? Well, fundamental attribution error is basically it's like a self-serving bias. It's a type of fundamental attribution error. It's where what you think the cause is and what other people think the cause is doesn't match up. So, for example, you were late going to the movies because you were late going to the movies. All right, you had to pick up your friends, and there was construction on the road on the way there. You're probably going to blame the construction. Oh, we would have been on time if not for the construction. Your friends will probably say, or you just should have left earlier. Right? You're not attributing what happened to like the same thing. You've made an error. 33, what are some different potential categorizations for love? Well, first of all, love, there's many different types. And all these different types of love I'm about to go over with you include uh, a combination of these three things: intimacy, passion, and commitment. All right, first you have non-love. All right, that's where you don't have any of those three things. Then you have liking. Right? You like somebody. That means there's intimacy is there. Then you have infatuated, which is passion is there. Then you have empty love, which is where only commitment is present. Then you have romantic love, which is where you have intimacy and passion. Um, compassionate love is where you have intimacy and commitment. Fatuous love is where you have passion and commitment. And consummate love, which is where you have all three: intimacy, passion, and commitment. Right. And 34, what are the causes for human aggression? Why do people get all aggressive and angsty? Well, one, is it evolutionary? It could be evolutionary. It's a survival thing, survival of the fittest. Um, it could be society, like putting on you like the views of what's considered masculine, maybe, and that's so you have to be aggressive to fit society's norms and roles for you. Childhood or any type of specific event, something traumatic that triggered aggression, like upbringing or environment, we don't know. So any of those things could cause human aggression. What was the point of the Milgram experiments? Remember, Milgram experiments, that's the one we talked about that had the electric shocks. Right, for getting a question wrong. The point of that was obedience. Right. What did the person who was giving the shock, to what extent and how far would they take obeying somebody? Listening to authority is to obey. What was the point of the Ash experiment? That was the one with the lines, where you had one line and then you select it from the three lines. You deliberately said, no, this line matches the other one. But then there was one person in there that wasn't in on it. And was like, and in their mind they're thinking you're wrong, but they're not going to actively say it. They're going to conform to the group. So that was on conformity. 37, what's the difference between obedience and conformity? Lucky you asked, because it deals with what we just talked about in 35 and 36. Obedience is you're listening to someone in authority. Conformity is you are like following the group. 38, how did Zimbardo's experiment illustrate the power of role schemas? 38, this is the Stanford prison experiment. All right, and Zimbardo found that people very readily are going to conform to social roles of what they're expected to do, and they really play into it, especially if the roles are strongly stereotyped. So they did what in their mind, they had a stereotype of how guards act and how prisoners act, and they conformed to that. All right, so you very easily will conform to those roles if you already have like a certain schema about what that role is supposed to do. 39, what is social facilitation? That's where if you do something well, you're going to do it even better when someone's watching, because you're showing off. Now, if it doesn't work, if like you're a little shaky on it and then someone watches you and then you'll fall apart. Social loafing, that's basically where you slack off in group work, because you know that you're all going to get the same grade, you're all going to get the same benefit from it. Someone's going to pick up the slack. Group polarization is basically you get together with a group of people that all think the same way as you do. You talk about one thing that you all have in common, and then when you're done talking, it's like you're even more extreme about that now. right? You just strengthened your opinion about whatever, all right? And it's become even more extreme. You're all the way on one end of the pole. Um, Group think is basically where you lose the ability to think as an individual. You think as part of a group or for the good of a group. You don't make decisions on your own anymore. 41, what's an example of self-fulfilling prophecy? Remember, self-fulfilling prophecy is like if someone thinks something about you so much that you start to believe that it's true. I know I went over an example with you in class that was my algebra teacher in high school, Miss Dolan. She thought that, imagine this, she thought I was thug life, and that I was bad and I was stealing her markers. And she thought like so terribly of me and, that I was a thief and all this stuff. I didn't do anything, but she thought it so much that I was like, well, might as well do it now. So I started stealing her markers. It was a self-fulfilling prophecy. What is normative social influence and informational social influence? Normative social influence is where what influences you is you desire approval. Right? You want to gain approval and avoid disapproval. Um, Informational social influence is where before you do anything, you kind of have to watch how like what others do and how they do it. You're going to follow the leader, but there has to be a leader and it's not you. Someone's got to do it first. And finally, what is a social trap? Right, a social trap is where you have a short-term solution to something, um, but it causes long-term loss. So let's say you need stitches for something, you put a Band-Aid on it, like, okay, that's going to help you now, but long-term down the line, that's not going to be the best thing for you to do. Right? So it's like socially what's good now and convenient, but may not be the best solution for later. All right, so there you go. We are done reviewing all content today with units 12 through 14, but overall, that's it. You're not learning anything new. All right, so from here, we're probably going to have a sample, like a practice test that we're going to take in class, as well as some sample FRQ stuff to go over and like structure and how to do that. So again, what I would recommend at this point, review all the Cramathon packets, notes, IDs, whatever it is that you have. Go on to Cyclopedia if you need to. Anything else in Edmodo under the AP Psych review folder. Um, go go to Learnerator or Learning Pod and take some practice tests before you take the actual practice exam, because we're going to look at that as we're going to treat it as if it is the real deal. All right, and what you get on that practice test, we're going to convert it and see what that would probably mean you would get on the real AP exam. All right, so any questions, email me or post to Edmodo, ask each other. All right, I'll see you in class.